England greeted the spring of 1886 with blossoming gardens, polished carriages and glittering ballrooms, but no heart welcomed the season more eagerly than Lady Evelyn Ashford's. At 22 she possessed grace, gentle intelligence, and a laugh that made even solemn servants smile. Raised within the halls of Ashford Manor, she believed kindness deserved kindness in return, and she dreamed not of crowns or titles but of becoming the finest ballroom dancer in the kingdom. Every afternoon she practiced waltzes beneath crystal chandeliers while her widowed mother's old music box filled the room with melodies, imagining the day she would glide through royal celebrations with effortless elegance. Her greatest admirer was not her fiancé or the neighboring ladies who envied her beauty. It was her spirited 8-year-old brother, Thomas, whose world revolved around following Evelyn through gardens, libraries, and sunlit orchards. Whenever she danced, he clapped with complete sincerity, declaring that angels surely learned their steps by watching his sister. Evelyn laughed, promised to save him the first dance at every future celebration, and believed life would always feel as bright as those golden afternoons. That illusion shattered during the annual royal parade. Villagers crowded the streets waving ribbons as decorated horses carried nobles through cheering crowds. Children perched upon fences while musicians filled the air with triumphant fanfares. Among the procession rolled an extravagant gilded carriage belonging to Lord Cedric Blackwell, a privileged young nobleman notorious for arrogance and reckless indulgence. Having spent the morning drinking with companions, Cedric ignored frightened warnings, seized the reins himself, and urged the magnificent horses into a dangerous gallop through the narrow village road. The celebration dissolved into panic. People scattered in every direction as the horses thundered forward beyond control. Mothers screamed for their children. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Dust rose like smoke beneath pounding hooves. Amid the chaos, Evelyn spotted Thomas standing motionless in the center of the road, frozen by terror as the racing carriage bore down upon him. Time seemed to slow until only one choice remained. Without pausing to think, she ran. She reached Thomas an instant before the carriage arrived, wrapped both arms around him, and hurled him toward the safety of waiting villagers. The frightened boy tumbled across the stones unharmed. Evelyn turned to follow, but the iron-rimmed wheels struck before she could move clear. The crushing impact threw her to the ground. The parade stopped. Silence replaced celebration. Thomas crawled toward his sister, sobbing uncontrollably while strangers fought to lift the shattered carriage away. Evelyn managed only a faint smile before darkness swallowed her consciousness. When she awakened days later inside Ashford Manor, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and every familiar face carried unbearable sorrow. The physicians spoke with practiced gentleness, yet their verdict shattered every hope she still possessed. Her injuries would never heal enough for her to walk again. The muscles that had carried every joyful dance were forever lost. No treatment known in England could restore what the accident had taken. The news traveled faster than compassion. Lord Cedric's influential family quietly purchased silence wherever truth threatened to appear. Witnesses changed their stories. Officials misplaced reports. Wealth and privilege buried justice beneath polished signatures and expensive promises. Within weeks the investigation ended without punishment, leaving Evelyn to carry every visible consequence while the man responsible returned comfortably to fashionable society. The losses multiplied with ruthless speed. Her fiancé visited once, unable to meet her eyes. Speaking softly about duty, reputation, and impossible futures, he returned her engagement ring before departing forever. Invitations ceased arriving. Friends who once filled the manor with laughter suddenly discovered reasons to stay away. Noblewomen whispered that tragedy was contagious, while ambitious mothers quietly removed Evelyn's portrait from conversations about eligible brides. Every closed door echoed louder than the last. Her father fought desperately to preserve the family's dignity, but grief settled heavily upon him. Watching his daughter struggle through endless pain while creditors circled the estate slowly broke the strength that had carried him through decades of responsibility. Before another winter ended, illness claimed his life. His funeral passed beneath gray skies, leaving Evelyn convinced she had buried not only her father but the last certainty she possessed. Ashford Manor gradually fell silent. Servants departed because wages could no longer be guaranteed. Rooms once alive with music remained locked behind dusty doors. Fresh flowers disappeared from windowsills. The grand ballroom where Evelyn had once practiced every morning became an echoing chamber filled only with memories. For 4 long years she rarely ventured beyond the estate, allowing loneliness to become as familiar as breathing itself. Yet every spring she positioned her wheelchair beside the tallest bedroom window overlooking the village square. From there she watched young couples laughing, spinning, and dancing beneath blooming trees while musicians played cheerful waltzes carried upward by the breeze. Hidden behind lace curtains, she pressed trembling fingers against the glass and silently wept for the life that continued without her. Deep inside an old cedar chest rested her satin dancing slippers, untouched yet impossible to discard. One rainy afternoon an embossed invitation bearing the royal seal arrived, requesting Lady Evelyn Ashford's presence at the King's magnificent masquerade ball. She barely glanced at the elegant script before placing it aside. Balls belonged to women who could dance, she believed, not to forgotten ladies who inspired whispers. Thomas, now 12 and far wiser than any child should have been, picked up the invitation and carried it to her. Kneeling beside her wheelchair, he took her hand exactly as she had once taken his in the village road. His voice trembled with gratitude rather than pity. "You saved my life," he whispered. "Please don't stop living yours." Those words lingered long after the rain faded. Days later, dressed in shimmering gold and hidden behind a delicate masquerade mask, Evelyn allowed the family carriage to carry her toward the illuminated royal palace, convinced she was traveling not toward hope, but toward the last ballroom she would ever enter. The royal palace shimmered beneath thousands of candle flames, its towering windows glowing like stars captured within crystal. Elegant carriages lined the sweeping entrance while liveried footmen welcomed England's nobility into the grand masquerade. Laughter drifted beneath marble archways, mingling with the distant strains of violins tuning for the evening's first waltz. Every guest arrived carrying hopes of admiration, advantageous introductions, or whispered romances. Lady Evelyn Ashford arrived carrying only fear. Her carriage stopped at the foot of the palace steps. Thomas stepped down first, then carefully lowered her wheelchair onto the polished stone before helping her settle gracefully into it. He adjusted the folds of her magnificent champagne gold gown, its embroidered flowers sparkling beneath the lantern light. The delicate masquerade mask concealed part of her face, yet nothing could hide the wheelchair resting beneath layers of elegant silk. "You look beautiful," Thomas said quietly. Evelyn smiled with practiced gentleness. "I only hope beauty is enough to make them forget everything else." He squeezed her shoulder before remaining behind as attendants escorted her inside. She wished she possessed even half of his courage. The ballroom stole her breath. Towering crystal chandeliers poured warm golden light across polished marble floors that reflected every movement like still water. Noble ladies glided through the room wearing gowns adorned with pearls, emeralds, diamonds, and lace finer than spider silk. Gentlemen in richly embroidered coats laughed confidently beneath ornate masks while servants carried silver trays overflowing with sparkling crystal glasses. Fresh roses climbed marble pillars, filling the air with a fragrance almost sweet enough to disguise Evelyn's rising anxiety. For one impossible moment, she almost believed she belonged there again. Then the whispers began. A lady in sapphire glanced toward her before lowering her fan to murmur something into her companion's ear. Another woman turned openly, allowing her gaze to linger on the wheelchair before offering a smile filled not with kindness but amusement. Gentlemen who noticed Evelyn quickly looked elsewhere, pretending sudden fascination with paintings or chandeliers. The masks concealed faces. They did not conceal cruelty. Evelyn moved quietly along the edge of the ballroom, trying to appear invisible. She greeted several familiar nobles with polite nods. Most answered with stiff courtesy before drifting away toward livelier company. Some behaved as though they had never known her at all. Across the room, ambitious mothers positioned their daughters where every influential bachelor could easily notice them. None positioned them anywhere near Evelyn. One elderly duchess looked toward her grandson just as his eyes wandered in Evelyn's direction. The old woman immediately guided him away. "No," she whispered sharply enough for Evelyn to hear. "There are far better futures waiting." The words settled heavily inside Evelyn's heart. She lowered her eyes. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps her future had ended beneath a carriage wheel 4 years earlier. The orchestra suddenly lifted their instruments. Conversation softened. The conductor raised his baton. The first notes of the opening waltz floated through the ballroom with breathtaking elegance. Immediately gentlemen began crossing the floor. One by one they bowed before smiling ladies. Hands met hands. Couples stepped gracefully onto the shining marble. Within moments the ballroom transformed into a sea of swirling silk and graceful movement. Evelyn waited. Surely someone would ask. Not because of pity. Not because of obligation. Simply because once, long ago, someone might have wished to know the woman beneath the tragedy. A young baron approached. Hope stirred inside her. He smiled politely. then walked past her to invite the laughing blonde standing behind. Another gentleman glanced toward Evelyn. His eyes met hers for a heartbeat. He hesitated. His mother quietly shook her head. He obeyed. Several more passed. Every passing moment felt longer than the last. Every untouched dance card became another silent rejection. She folded trembling hands within her lap, pretending not to notice. The music continued. The dancers laughed. Her world grew quieter. Nearby, two fashionable countesses watched her with undisguised satisfaction. One sighed dramatically. How terribly awkward. The other smiled. She should have remained at home. The first laughed softly. Even charity has its limits. Several nearby ladies hid amused smiles. Another noblewoman added without lowering her voice. Who would waste a first dance on a cripple? The sentence struck harder than any carriage wheel ever had. Conversation continued around her as though nothing cruel had been spoken. No one challenged them. No one defended her. The silence of decent people wounded almost as deeply as the mockery itself. Evelyn kept smiling. Years of loneliness had taught her how. But tears slowly gathered beneath her mask. She stared toward the dancers crossing the floor with effortless joy. Every graceful turn reminded her of another life. Another Evelyn. The young woman who had once believed dancing was simply another word for happiness. She whispered so softly that she believed no one else could possibly hear. I already knew no one would ever choose a girl like me. The confession escaped like a broken prayer. Across the ballroom, another conversation stopped. Standing near the king was Duke Alexander Ravenshire. At 31, Alexander was admired throughout England not merely because he possessed vast estates and one of the oldest ducal titles in the kingdom, but because his character had earned equal respect. Tall, composed, and clean-shaven, dressed in an impeccably tailored black evening coat embroidered with subtle gold thread, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. Since arriving, nearly every ambitious noble family had attempted to introduce him to their daughters. He had politely declined every invitation. Now his attention rested entirely upon Evelyn. He had heard every word. He looked toward the circle of laughing ladies. Then toward the lonely woman sitting beyond the dancers. His expression changed. Not with pity. With certainty. Nearby debutantes noticed him moving. Excited whispers spread immediately. The Duke is finally choosing. Young ladies straightened their gowns. Fans fluttered nervously. Mothers smiled in anticipation. Alexander ignored every hopeful glance. Without speaking, he stepped onto the ballroom floor. The dancers instinctively moved aside. Conversations faded. Even the musicians seemed to sense something unusual unfolding. The Duke continued walking. Not toward the celebrated beauties gathered beneath the chandeliers. Not toward the daughters of wealthy earls. Not toward the kingdom's most admired debutantes. He walked past every one of them. 100 astonished faces slowly turned to follow his path. Each measured step carried him closer to the woman who believed no one would ever choose her. Evelyn remained unaware until polished black shoes stopped directly before her wheelchair. She slowly lifted her tear-filled eyes. Duke Alexander Ravenshire stood before her. Without the slightest hesitation, he lowered himself onto one knee. An audible gasp swept through the silent ballroom. The Duke gently reached for her trembling gloved hand, lifted it with extraordinary care, and pressed a respectful kiss upon her fingers as though greeting a queen. Looking directly into her astonished eyes, he smiled with quiet warmth that dissolved every cruel whisper surrounding them. His voice carried clearly through the hushed ballroom. I have spent this entire evening searching for the bravest woman in this room, he said. Lady Evelyn. I believe I have finally found her. Then, before anyone recovered from the impossible sight unfolding before them, he offered his hand once more and softly asked, Would you honor me with the first dance? Duke Alexander's question lingered in the silent ballroom like the final note of a hymn. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed upon Evelyn, waiting to see whether she would refuse from fear or accept despite it. Her fingers trembled within his gentle grasp. For years she had imagined someone inviting her to dance again, yet now that the impossible moment had arrived, she scarcely trusted it was real. I cannot stand, she whispered, afraid her voice might shatter the fragile miracle before her. Alexander's smile never faded. I did not ask you to stand. He rose gracefully and stepped beside her wheelchair instead of in front of it. Turning toward the orchestra, he inclined his head with quiet confidence. The conductor hesitated only a heartbeat before lifting his baton once more. Violins awakened, cellos joined softly beneath them, and the grand waltz flowed across the ballroom again. Alexander rested one gloved hand lightly upon the polished handle of Evelyn's wheelchair while keeping the other gently clasped around hers. Together they moved across the marble floor with calm elegance. Rather than attempting to imitate ordinary dancers, he allowed the music itself to guide their movements. He circled slowly, matching every graceful turn to the rhythm until the wheelchair became part of the dance instead of an obstacle within it. Silence filled the ballroom. Not the cruel silence of judgment. The stunned silence of witnessing something no one had imagined possible. The glittering chandeliers reflected across the polished floor as Evelyn's golden gown spread beautifully around her like flowing sunlight. Alexander neither hurried nor hesitated. Every movement carried unmistakable dignity. He looked only at Evelyn, never once acknowledging the astonished faces surrounding them. Gradually her rigid shoulders relaxed. The fear that had gripped her heart since entering the palace loosened with every gentle turn. For the first time in 4 years she no longer felt like someone watching life from the edge of the room. She felt included within it. When the final notes faded, applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Some guests clapped cautiously, others enthusiastically, while a few remained motionless, unwilling to celebrate what challenged every prejudice they held. Alexander ignored them all. Instead, he leaned closer and asked quietly, "Would you care for some fresh air?" She nodded. He personally guided her through towering glass doors leading into the royal gardens. Cool evening air greeted them, scented with blooming roses and freshly cut lavender. Moonlight silvered the fountains while distant music drifted softly from the palace behind them. Away from curious eyes, Evelyn finally released the tears she had struggled to hide. "I embarrassed you," she said. Alexander looked genuinely puzzled. "You honored me." "They laughed at me." "They laughed because they have never learned the difference between perfection and courage." She lowered her gaze. "I used to believe courage meant saving someone once. And now I think courage is surviving after no one applauds the sacrifice." Alexander remained silent for several moments. Then he answered quietly, "I believe courage is returning to the ballroom after the world convinces you never to enter again." His words settled gently inside the broken places she had guarded for years. They wandered slowly through winding garden paths, speaking until the palace lights shimmered like distant stars beyond flowering hedges. Evelyn confessed how she still dreamed about dancing. Alexander admitted he had always disliked shallow conversations disguised as courtship. They laughed unexpectedly over childhood adventures, stubborn tutors, ruined piano lessons, and Thomas's endless talent for climbing forbidden trees. By the time dawn hinted at the horizon, Evelyn realized hours had passed without anyone mentioning her wheelchair. Alexander visited Ashford Manor the following week. Then the week after that. Soon his visits became an unspoken tradition. He never arrived carrying extravagant jewels or dramatic declarations. Instead, he brought books he believed she would enjoy, rare sheet music for her piano, and stories collected during his travels across Europe. Together they spent long afternoons in the manor library discussing poetry, history, philosophy, and the strange habits of people who valued appearances above kindness. Thomas adored him immediately. The young boy challenged the Duke to chess, lost repeatedly, and insisted each defeat resulted from unfair luck rather than superior strategy. Alexander accepted every rematch with patient amusement until the manor echoed once again with cheerful laughter that servants had not heard in years. Winter arrived wrapped in quiet snowfall. One afternoon Alexander surprised Evelyn by preparing a comfortable carriage fitted especially for her wheelchair. Wrapped beneath warm blankets, they rode through silent forests where snow rested upon pine branches like powdered crystal. Neither hurried to fill every silence. Sometimes companionship itself proved more comforting than conversation. During another visit he discovered an old piano standing forgotten inside the manor's music room. "You still play," he observed after hearing a melody drift through the corridor. "Only when no one is listening. Why hide something so beautiful?" "Because I remember what the music once accompanied." Without another word he sat beside the instrument and quietly turned pages while she played. When she finished, he applauded exactly as Thomas had done years earlier. Not politely, proudly. As spring returned, Alexander often pushed her wheelchair himself through Ashford Manor's rose gardens despite repeated protests from servants eager to perform the task. "Your Grace," one elderly butler finally murmured, "this is hardly suitable." Alexander smiled. Kindness rarely concerns itself with suitability. Word of their growing friendship spread quickly across England. Some admired the Duke's compassion. Others questioned his judgment. Society's drawing rooms filled with whispered speculation. He feels sorry for her. It cannot possibly last. A duke requires a duchess who can host dances, not watch them. Evelyn pretended such remarks no longer reached her. Alexander knew better. Without telling her, he quietly began writing letters throughout Europe. Distinguished physicians, renowned surgeons, pioneering engineers, and respected scholars all received personal invitations funded entirely from his own fortune. If any genuine treatment or innovation existed that might improve Evelyn's comfort or independence, he intended to find it. Yet he instructed every doctor carefully. "You are not coming because she requires fixing," he wrote. "You are coming because extraordinary people deserve every opportunity available." Months passed. Hope slowly replaced routine. Then an unwelcome carriage arrived in London. Lord Cedric Blackwell had returned from extended travels abroad. The moment he learned the Duke of Ravenshire had become devoted to Lady Evelyn Ashford, genuine fear crept beneath his polished confidence. He remembered the accident better than anyone alive. He remembered the drinking, the racing horses, the terrified witnesses, and every coin his powerful family had spent to bury the truth. If Alexander ever discovered what had truly happened, everything Cedric possessed could disappear overnight. He decided the safest defense was another attack. Anonymous gossip began appearing inside fashionable newspapers. Society columns hinted that Evelyn had cleverly manipulated the kingdom's most desirable bachelor through calculated helplessness. Rumors spread that Ashford Manor's debts had inspired an elaborate scheme to secure the Duke's immense fortune. Invitations once again disappeared from her doorstep. Old acquaintances crossed streets rather than greet her. The whispers returned stronger than before, dressed now as respectable concern instead of open cruelty. Evelyn considered ending the friendship before Alexander's reputation suffered beside hers. She composed 3 farewell letters. She burned every one. Days later, the royal family hosted a magnificent spring reception attended by nearly every influential noble in England. The ballroom buzzed with speculation as Alexander escorted Evelyn through the towering doors, his hand resting confidently upon her wheelchair. Whispered conversations swept the room before either spoke. Alexander surveyed the gathering with perfect composure, then stepped forward until every eye turned toward him. Raising a crystal glass, he waited for complete silence before announcing that Lady Evelyn Ashford had accepted his proposal of marriage, and that he intended to make her the next Duchess of Ravenshire before the entire astonished kingdom. The announcement struck the ballroom with the force of thunder. Crystal glasses paused halfway to waiting lips. Conversations dissolved into stunned silence before erupting into hundreds of hurried whispers. Noblewomen who had spent months dreaming of becoming the Duchess of Ravenshire stared at Evelyn with open disbelief, while ambitious fathers quietly calculated how such an impossible engagement could threaten the careful order of their world. Alexander remained perfectly composed beside Evelyn's wheelchair, his hand resting gently upon its polished handle as though no greater place existed for him to stand. The days that followed were merciless. London newspapers questioned the Duke's judgment without daring to criticize him directly. Society columns described Evelyn as unfortunate, unsuitable, and tragically incapable of fulfilling the expectations of a duchess. Anonymous writers insisted that love should never outweigh duty. Invitations addressed to Alexander still arrived in abundance, but many included subtle suggestions that Lady Evelyn should remain at home for the sake of everyone's comfort. Others were less restrained, declaring openly that England deserved a healthier future duchess. Evelyn read only one newspaper. She folded it quietly. Then she never opened another. "I have become the burden they always believed I was," she said softly one afternoon while sitting beside the library window at Ashford Manor. Alexander closed the book he had been reading. "You have become the excuse they use to reveal who they truly are." She looked toward him with tired eyes. "What if they are right? A duchess should dance with diplomats, host grand celebrations, and welcome the kingdom with grace. You already welcome people with grace. I cannot give them what tradition expects. I have never wished to marry tradition." His certainty steadied her, yet it could not silence the growing storm beyond the manor walls. Meanwhile, Lord Cedric Blackwell watched events unfold with increasing desperation. Every newspaper criticizing Evelyn offered him temporary relief, but Alexander's unwavering devotion refused to weaken. The Duke ignored gossip, refused private warnings, and continued appearing beside Evelyn at every public engagement. Cedric understood that affection built upon admiration could become dangerously difficult to destroy. If anyone began asking why Alexander respected Evelyn so deeply, someone might eventually ask how she had lost the use of her legs. Fear sharpened his cruelty. When the king announced a magnificent state banquet celebrating the opening of Parliament, nearly every influential noble family in England gathered beneath the palace's glittering chandeliers. Alexander escorted Evelyn into the grand hall exactly as he always did, refusing every attempt by servants to separate them. Though whispers followed their arrival, neither acknowledged them. Evelyn wore a deep emerald gown embroidered with silver vines, and for the first time since the masquerade she held her head proudly despite the hundreds of curious eyes surrounding her. Dinner progressed beneath polished manners and measured conversation. Then Cedric rose. Lifting his crystal glass, he smiled with effortless confidence. "Your Majesty," he began smoothly, "may I offer congratulations to His Grace on his remarkable engagement?" The king inclined his head politely. Cedric turned toward Evelyn. "It is comforting to know that fortune occasionally smiles upon those who have, regrettably, ruined their own futures." The words drifted across the silent hall. Several nobles looked away. Others waited eagerly for humiliation to unfold. Cedric continued, "One cannot blame destiny forever. Some lives collapse because of unfortunate choices." Evelyn's fingers tightened upon her napkin. Alexander started to rise. Before he could speak, another voice interrupted. "No." Every head turned. Thomas Ashford stepped forward from among the guests. Now 16, he no longer resembled the frightened child who had once stood frozen in a village road. Though still young, grief had given him quiet strength beyond his years. His hands trembled, yet his voice did not. "My sister never ruined her own life." The banquet hall became utterly still. Thomas faced the king directly. "She gave hers to save mine." No one moved. He described the royal parade exactly as he remembered it. He spoke of the racing horses, the screaming villagers, the moment fear rooted him to the ground, and the instant Evelyn reached him. He remembered flying through the air as she threw him toward safety. He remembered hearing the terrible crash before seeing his sister lying motionless beneath the shattered carriage. Every sentence carried the unmistakable weight of memory rather than invention. Cedric laughed dismissively. "A touching tale from a devoted brother." "It is the truth," Thomas answered. Cedric spread his hands. "Truth requires witnesses. I am one." A child remembers emotion, not facts. Before Thomas could reply, another voice echoed through the hall. "I remember the facts." An elderly man wearing the simple clothing of a retired stable master stepped forward from the servants' entrance. Age had bent his shoulders but not his conscience. "I cared for the horses assigned to Lord Cedric's carriage that morning," he said. "His Grace was intoxicated before the parade even began. I begged the coachman not to surrender the reins." Uneasy murmurs rippled across the banquet. Cedric's confidence faltered. "You have no proof." The stable master reached slowly into his worn coat and produced a weathered leather journal. "I kept records of every horse under my care." He handed it to the king's chamberlain. "The entry remains exactly as I wrote it." The chamberlain opened the faded pages. There, dated precisely to the morning of the accident, appeared a brief but unmistakable notation describing Cedric's drunken insistence upon driving despite repeated warnings. Before anyone could recover, another elderly man approached from the far end of the hall wearing the faded uniform of a retired royal guard. "I also remained silent," he confessed. Shame filled his weathered face. "I accepted money to alter my report." A shocked murmur swept across the nobles. The guard removed a sealed packet from inside his coat. "I have carried the original testimony for 4 years because I could no longer bear the weight of my cowardice." The king accepted the document personally. Its contents matched Thomas's account in every significant detail. Witness after witness stepped forward. A village merchant remembered the racing carriage. A former palace clerk admitted official papers had been replaced before reaching the magistrate. Even a dismissed servant from the Blackwell estate confessed to delivering heavy purses of gold to influential officials during the weeks following the accident. Each testimony strengthened the next until denial became impossible. Cedric's face drained of color. Alexander never spoke. He simply stood beside Evelyn, allowing truth to defend itself after years of silence. The king slowly rose from his chair. His expression carried neither anger nor sympathy, only justice. "Lord Cedric Blackwell," he declared, "you stand accused of reckless endangerment, corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, and deliberate deception of the crown." Royal guards immediately surrounded Cedric. He protested desperately. He denied every accusation. No one listened. By dawn the investigation had already begun. Within weeks hidden financial records, altered legal documents and long-forgotten witness statements confirmed every confession presented at the banquet. Cedric's title was stripped away by royal decree. His estates were confiscated to repay those harmed through his corruption. His fortune disappeared into crown custody, and he was sentenced according to the law he had believed wealth could forever silence. The kingdom watched in astonishment. Newspapers that had once mocked Evelyn now printed her courage across their front pages. Noble families who had ignored her arrived bearing awkward apologies. Mothers who had once pulled sons away from her lowered their eyes whenever she entered a room. The ballroom that had laughed at her sacrifice now spoke of it with reverence. At the next royal assembly, Alexander stepped before the gathered court and turned toward Evelyn. His voice carried through the vast chamber with calm conviction. The strongest person in this kingdom never wore a crown. She simply chose another life over her own. Then he walked back to her side, lowered himself onto one knee exactly as he had on the night they first met, gently took her hand before the silent court, and with quiet hope shining in his eyes, prepared to ask her one final question that would forever change both their lives. Alexander remained on one knee, Evelyn's trembling hand resting within his own. The silent court watched as hope and fear struggled across her tear-filled face. 4 years earlier she had believed her life ended beneath iron wheels. Now the man who could have chosen anyone in England waited only for her answer. She searched his eyes for pity and found none. She found love. "Will you give me every dance for the rest of our lives?" he asked. Evelyn drew a careful breath. Tears escaped despite her smile. "Yes," she whispered, "because you taught me that dancing begins in the heart, not the feet." The hall erupted before the final word faded. The king himself applauded first, followed by queens, dukes, servants, musicians, and guests until every corner echoed with thunderous admiration. Thomas covered his face, overwhelmed by gratitude. Alexander rose, slipped a simple sapphire ring onto Evelyn's finger, then bent to kiss her forehead instead of her lips, honoring both her dignity and the sacredness of the moment before the assembled kingdom. No celebration had ever sounded so sincere. Even those who once mocked her stood with lowered heads. Understanding courage had rewritten every rule they believed unchangeable forever. That unforgettable evening together at last. Preparations for the royal wedding transformed England into a nation anticipating something greater than another noble ceremony. Seamstresses embroidered gowns through sleepless nights. Gardeners filled palace courtyards with thousands of white roses and climbing ivy. Bells were polished, silver restored, stained glass windows cleaned until sunlight poured through them like liquid gold. Yet amid every grand arrangement, Evelyn requested only one promise. She refused to hide her wheelchair behind flowers, curtains, or carefully positioned attendants. "If I begin my marriage pretending I am someone else," she quietly explained, "then the frightened girl who hid inside Ashford Manor truly loses." Alexander accepted her wish without hesitation. "You will never need to disappear beside me," he answered. "The world can adjust its eyes instead." Those simple words became the foundation upon which every remaining decision rested. The cathedral overflowed long before the ceremony began. Farmers stood beside lords, children beside generals, widows beside wealthy merchants. They had traveled from distant counties not merely to witness a duke marry, but to see whether the kingdom truly intended to honor the woman whose sacrifice had once been ignored. When the great doors slowly opened, silence spread through the vast sanctuary. Evelyn entered exactly as she had chosen, seated proudly in her elegant black wheelchair adorned only with fresh white roses. Alexander did not wait at the altar. Instead, he walked the entire length of the aisle until he reached her, then gently placed his hand upon her shoulder before escorting her forward himself. No one noticed the wheelchair after that. They noticed only devotion walking beside courage. The archbishop spoke solemn vows beneath soaring arches while sunlight illuminated colored glass above their heads. Alexander promised to stand beside Evelyn in joy, hardship, celebration, and silence. Evelyn promised never again to let fear convince her she deserved less than love honestly given. When they exchanged rings, Thomas smiled through tears, remembering the desperate afternoon his sister had thrown him beyond death's reach without pausing to count the cost. The king himself signed the marriage register as principal witness, calling it one of the greatest honors of his reign. Outside, thousands erupted into joyous cheers as flower petals drifted through bright summer air. Children ran laughing beside the royal carriage, not because they had seen perfection, but because they had witnessed hope wearing ordinary human form. That evening the palace ballroom welcomed guests once more. It was the very room where Evelyn had whispered that no one would ever choose her. Crystal chandeliers sparkled exactly as they had months before, yet the atmosphere felt transformed. The same marble floor, the same orchestra, the same towering mirrors remained unchanged. Only the hearts within them had become different. When the conductor announced the first dance of the wedding reception, every conversation ceased. Alexander approached Evelyn exactly as he had on the night of the masquerade. Without asking her to stand, he rested one hand gently upon her chair and the other within hers. The orchestra began a slow, graceful waltz. Together they moved through the center of the ballroom with quiet confidence, proving once again that harmony belonged to souls, not footsteps. Many guests openly wept, remembering the cruel laughter that had once echoed there. After the final note faded, the king rose before the assembled court. "England has long celebrated strength measured by swords, titles, and victories," he declared. "Today we celebrate strength measured by sacrifice." He announced the creation of the kingdom's first grand ballroom designed so that every citizen, including those using wheelchairs or walking aids, could participate fully in royal celebrations. Architects immediately received commissions. Public gardens would include smoother pathways. The Crown would establish funds supporting victims of carriage accidents and those living with lasting injuries. Applause thundered across the hall because everyone understood these changes had not begun with politics. They had begun with one young woman refusing to surrender her dignity. Evelyn embraced that responsibility with quiet determination. Together with Alexander, she established the Ashford Foundation, dedicating its resources to injured children, struggling families, and survivors of accidents abandoned by wealthy offenders. Thomas fulfilled the promise he had silently carried since childhood by studying medicine with relentless discipline. Years later he became one of England's leading physicians devoted to treating spinal injuries, combining compassion with innovation because he never forgot the sister who had surrendered her own future so that he might have one. Every patient entering his care encountered not only remarkable knowledge but unwavering kindness. Whenever anyone praised his accomplishments, Thomas simply answered, "Everything I became began with her courage." Seasons turned gently across the years. Ashford Manor filled once more with music, laughter, visiting children, and blooming gardens. Alexander still pushed Evelyn's wheelchair through the rose paths himself despite the endless availability of servants. They continued reading together in the library, playing piano duets during rainy evenings, and taking peaceful carriage rides through snowy forests every winter. Their marriage was never remembered because it resembled fairy tales. It was remembered because it resembled steadfast love. Whenever difficulties appeared, they faced them side by side rather than pretending they did not exist. Visitors often remarked that the Duke looked happiest not while addressing Parliament or hosting grand banquets, but while listening to Evelyn laugh at Thomas's terrible jokes over afternoon tea. Many years later, another royal masquerade illuminated the palace. Young women wearing beautiful gowns entered confidently, including several seated proudly in elegant wheelchairs. No one stared. No mothers hurried sons away. No cruel whispers poisoned the music. Every guest understood that the ballroom belonged equally to everyone willing to enter it with courage. As the orchestra began the evening's first waltz, Alexander guided Evelyn onto the polished floor exactly as he always had. He lifted her hand, kissed her gloved fingers, and smiled with the same warmth she had first seen beneath the chandeliers years before. "The first dance everyone told me not to choose," he whispered, "became the greatest blessing of my life." Around them the orchestra soared, the ballroom rose in heartfelt applause, and an entire kingdom celebrated not out of pity, but in grateful admiration for a love that had transformed countless lives forever.